December of 1944, American airmen stationed at bases across southern Italy were engaged in war. Thousands had already died in combat, were wounded or languished in prisoner of war camps in occupied Europe and Germany. There were 21 heavy bomb groups stationed at bases across southern Italy. Most were carved from wheat fields, vineyards, and orchards. 15 of these groups flew the B-24 Liberator. The remainder flew the B-17 Flying Fortress. One of the B-24 groups, the 485th, was based near the town of Venosa. This group arrived earlier in the year and had already suffered more than 450 combat losses. Many more would follow before the war ended. There would have been many more losses if it weren't for their little friends, the fighter escorts. Their escorts consisted of P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs, who protected them against enemy fighter attacks on their long missions across Germany and occupied Europe. The airmen developed an affection for all the escorts. Their lives in many cases depended upon them. These Mustang fighters in this theater wore unique and visible markings on their tails. One of the groups, the 332nd Fighter Group, was affectionately called the Red Tails due to their tails being painted a bright red color. Most of the meetings between the bomber airmen and their fighter escorts took place over German-occupied territory, but there were occasional visits to the bomber bases by the fighter pilots. The men of the 45th welcomed these visits, where they got the opportunity to see close up the planes who were their escorts and to meet the men who flew them. Individual bombers occasionally stopped at the fighter bases as well. The fighter bases were closer to the front lines and became safe havens for damaged bombers in planes short on fuel or with wounded aboard. The meeting in this story took place for a different reason. On December 29, 1944, 27 bombers from the 485th Bomb Group took off on a combat mission to Verona, Italy. It was supposed to be a milk run, an easy mission of about 6 hours. The short mission was welcomed by the airmen, many of whom had recently been on long, flak-filled missions to the far reaches of northern Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Germany. It was a cold and overcast day when the bombers took off from Venosa, heading out over the Adriatic Sea before they turned north, climbing to altitude and paralleling the Italian coastline on their way to northern Italy. Tragedy struck unexpectedly over the water as the planes climbed to their assigned altitude. Witnesses saw an object fall from the nose of one of the bombers. Lieutenant Alan Steinberg, a bombardier and a recent arrival in the group, wasn't wearing his parachute when he tripped and fell through the nose wheel door. The men watched in horror as he fell. Near the northern tip of the Adriatic, the bomber formation made a sweeping left turn.
We considered any target in northern Italy as being pretty much of a milk run, primarily because it's such a short distance to the target. But they did have some pretty accurate flak up there.
That mission was, excuse me. That mission was great all the way up to the target. And when we got to the target, there was much flak. And our mission was to bomb a rail yard, and all the buildings there were storage buildings and things like that. And the flak was very heavy, but it was behind us most of the time till the last units got over there, and then there was a few airplanes that got shot up a little bit. On the way back, the weather really started to worsen. And we got so far, and it was just a big, almost like a big fog. And so the whole group dropped down as far as they could, and but it kept getting worse.
Our group commander, who didn't fly that day, somehow got hold of a B-25, and I don't know how he did that. I don't recall us having one at the base. But he saw that there was a terrific snowfall at the base, and it accumulated to about 5 inches. And he immediately recognized that this was not a good place to have his B-24s land. The base commander knew that if he had his, the group commander had his airplanes land on that steel runway that was covered with 5 inches of snow, that there were going to be B-24s everywhere. Just touch the brakes and you'll start skidding, and you have trouble with directional control, and we might go down the runway sideways or backwards or slide off the runway. So he arranged, I don't know how he did that, or maybe he just did it, but he told certain squadrons to go to air bases that he knew were clear of snow. And looking back on it, it was very fortunate for me, because the landing field that we were directed to was Remitelli. And Remitelli was the home base of these black fighter pilots. It was the 332nd Fighter Group. All black pilots, all black cadre. The entire base were blacks. We didn't know what to expect when we landed at Remitelli. In fact, I don't recall even knowing that that was the situation, that it was a black base. But we landed, and we had to land on the runway, and the first airplane to land could not leave the runway very far because the taxi strips were designed for P-51s they have a narrow landing gear tread. And our B-24s have a much wider one, and the taxiways just wouldn't accommodate us. So the first B-24s had to stop at the end of the runway, and succeeding 24s as they landed would land and nose to tail, nose to tail, nose to tail.
Everybody that flew into that base that day were scattered all over that base, wherever they could find a place to sleep. And some were very nice accommodations. Some of them got beds, and they moved people out of tents and moved some of our people in. And some of those people basically had movies at night, and so they treated them very well. We learned about the red tails when we got overseas, and we got to our base, and talking to the other airmen there that had flown many missions, they told us about the red tails, and so we were pretty well informed about them to begin with.
This was just after Christmas, and my pilot, the guys I was staying with, brought out his boxes that he had received from the States, all kinds of candies and goodies, and even a cake. I don't know how it survived, but you didn't eat it with a fork, you eat it with your fingers. It was so beat up by the time it got to Italy. It was a little bit awkward, you know. I was plunked down in his tent, and we don't know each other, we were feeling each other out. And we started chatting back and forth, and finally we met on a common ground, and that was flying. He was a fighter pilot with his describing maneuvers, you know, how fighter pilots have to use their hands, and a bomber pilot. And it was no time at all until we were just not black guy and white guy. We were just a couple of pilots talking about flying. And we met, like I say, on common ground. It was, from there on, it was just as easy as anything to greet him when he'd come back from doing something, and chatting with him over things. There was no, the awkwardness period was gone immediately.
But our crew, the only place we could find to sleep was in the non-coms, place where they met every night and had their drinks and talked about what happened that day. And so so we slept on their tables after they closed that every night. We've heard stories about their flying and things, and they were very good pilots.
We didn't have water in the tent, and he would not let me go to the trouble of going to get water and bringing it back for our canteens. We used aviation fuel in the stove, and to replenish the supply, he would go get it. He didn't want me to bother with it. You know, he was the host. It was a real eye-opener for me. This guy from Pittsburgh, who has had very little contact with blacks other than a black neighborhood near my home, and there was very little contact between those two neighborhoods. And to suddenly be put down in the midst of a little city of blacks was quite an eye-opener, and particularly the greeting that we got.
We were out walking one day just around the base to see what it looked like, and see their P-51s and things. And along came Davis, and he was a colonel, and he had a couple of non-coms with him, and I think one of his assistants. He was a very tall man.
I was the youngest of 5 boys, and the older boys apparently had some prejudices, and I guess some of that rubbed off on me. I guess it had to, and I lost him with Remitelli.
It was basically kind of overcast all the time, because you know this was during the winter, and they weren't flying, and they weren't flying because we weren't flying.
When the time came to leave, we had already sent most of the crew back by truck back to our home field at Venosa, but the pilot, the co-pilot, navigator, flight engineer, and radio operators stayed with the airplane, and we flew it from Remitelli back to Venosa. But as we were boarding the airplane, and as I passed the radio operator's station, he has his radio in front of him, a chair, little desk to write on. I saw a letter, and I picked it up and read it.
To the visiting pilots and crew, you've been a guest of the 332nd All-Negro Fighter Group. We hope that our facilities, such as they are suitable and adequate enough to have made your stay here a pleasant one. On behalf of Colonel Davis and the command, I extend to you our most hearty wishes for a Happy New Year and many happier landings. You're welcome to return here at any time, and I'm sure that we can make your stay here an enjoyable one. The pilots of this command have expressed their desire to have it made clear that it is a pleasure to be able to protect you, look after your well-being both in the air and on the ground. Remember, when you're up there and see the red-tailed Mustangs in the sky, they're the friends of the 332nd Fighter Group. Here is hoping for a quicker end to this war and better, more peaceful world. Many happy landings. Signed, Eugene D. Weaver, Captain, Air Corps, Public Relations Officer. Signed January 3rd, 1945.
After 6 days, the weather got better, and so it wasn't a problem getting out of there. It took a while because we had 17 aircraft in there, and but it was fine until we got back to our base, and it was kind of a downcast day again, and but when we came into our base, there was still 12 to 15 inches of snow on our runway, and I couldn't figure out why we were coming back because it was really awful. When we got down to the runway, the aircraft just stopped right in the middle, and it wouldn't go any farther. So we had to really gun the engines to get it moving again. and there was snow up inside the aircraft, and it was a mess.
I'm sure at the time I recognized that that letter that was left on the radio operator's table was very significant. You know, I was a 19-year-old guy, but I had enough understanding of the situation to realize this is pretty meaningful, and it meant a lot to me. So I kept it. And when I got back to the base, I was writing this letter to Mom, and I included that in it, so I didn't want to keep it with me for fear it get lost. It's dated January 4, 1945, 7:30 at night.
Dear Mom, haven't written for the past few days because I was away from home for nearly a week. We flew a mission to northern Italy, and when we returned our field was closed, due to weather. We landed at a P-51 fighter field and couldn't get off for 5 days. All the pilots and ground crew were Negroes. They treated us like kings. I slept with a pilot from Kansas City, and he couldn't do enough for me. He shared his PX rations with me and wouldn't let me get gas for his stove, water, etc. When we were getting ready to leave, I found the enclosed note on the radio operator's table in our ship. These boys seem to have a high regard for the bomber pilots, and I know that those Mustangs look mighty comforting on the way to and from the target. We were forced to drop out of formation once coming back from Blechhammer due to an oxygen leak. A P-51 and a P-38 sat on either wing all the way back. Man, they are beautiful up there. Good night, Mom. I love you. Jim.
Word quickly spread about the treatment the men received at Remitelli, hastened by a story in the camp newsletter. Colonel John Tomhave, the 485th commander, was impressed by the stories he heard from his men. He wrote a commendation letter to Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, the 332nd commander. He wrote a similar letter to the commander of the 366th Air Service Squadron at Remitelli.
Dear Major Jones, on behalf of the officers and enlisted men of the 485th Bombardment Group, I want to personally thank you for the courtesy and assistance which you and the personnel of the 366th Air Service Squadron so splendidly offered to our crews, which landed at your base on the 29th of December 1944. I fully realize what an inconvenience this forced landing must have made on your facilities, and the remarkable manner in which you people of the 15th Fighter Command rose to the situation is all the more commendable. The very able assistance which your service squadron has given to the 332nd Fighter Group is well known, and now you have proven yourselves just as capable in servicing our heavy bombers. Sincerely yours, Jack B. Tomhave, Colonel, Air Corps, Commanding.
The returning airmen also wrote home to loved ones about what had occurred. One such letter was written by Wayne Whiting, a tail gunner, who spent 2 days with the Red Tails before returning to base by truck.
January 1st, 1945. Dear Mother, we went on a mission on the 29th, and on the way back to base the weather got so bad we were forced to land at another field. It was a Negro fighter field. I lived in a tent 2 nights with Negroes. They treated us very nice and gave us rations, and we had a big time listening to their experiences. They were close to the front of the Tunisian campaign, and also in the invasion of Sicily and Italy. We came back by truck last night, some of us. We left some of the crew there to bring back the plane when weather permits. Just us gunners and the bombardier came back. That was my 10th mission. We were up to Verona, Italy, bombing on that mission. Don't worry about me spending my money for drink, as I don't care for the Italian poison water. Our crew doesn't gamble, so that is one consolation. Love, your son, Wayne.
Captain Gerald Morris hadn't written to his wife for several days, and immediately did so after returning to Venosa, describing what occurred there.
My dearest darling, no doubt you've been very anxious about me the past few days because you haven't been getting regular letters as usual. I mailed you a note explaining how it would be. I hope you received it. The tie-up was due to me being away from my own base for several days, much longer than I anticipated. I was so sure of returning at any moment that I failed to write even the note for a couple of days. Returning from my 20th sortie, I was forced to land at a fighter base about an hour's flying time from my own. The pilots and all personnel are Negroes. Altogether, I spent 5 nights there and stayed in the house of a flight commander who is from Thomasville, Georgia. He's a fine fellow and did everything possible to make my stay there comfortable. When I see you, I will tell you all about it. P.S. Enclosed is the church program. The Negroes had a wonderful quartet, and we had communion service with the boys.
The stories lived on long after the men returned to their base. John Strang, a bombardier, recalled a conversation with one of the mechanics who approached his B-24, Nudus K II, shortly after they landed. The mechanic, Sergeant Poole, marveled at the size of the big bomber in comparison to the small P-51s parked nearby. He was also impressed with the nose art. He said that Colonel Davis never would have allowed nude paintings on his P-51s. Strang was one of the visiting airmen who returned to Venosa by truck, and recalled that many of the men lamented missing the New Year's Eve party with booze supplied by Colonel Davis himself. As might be expected in these days of segregation, not all the men were happy to be at the fighter base. Art Kane was a nose gunner on Captain Morris's crew and was on one of the first planes to land. A couple of the men on his crew weren't exactly happy to be at the all-black base, particularly when housed in tents with some of the mechanics. The men carried no money on their combat missions and couldn't even buy a drink. The first evening, their host insisted on buying the men drinks in the enlisted men's club. A couple of drinks later, attitudes changed and the barriers dissolved. They all had a great time at Remitelli and were even served breakfast in bed, complete with sweet rolls and raisins in them, something they never had at their own base. Although a sign marks a spot, today in Italy there are few visible reminders that an American fighter base called Remitelli ever existed. The pier steel planking that formed the runway was removed when the base was closed many years ago. Some of the PSP found its way to surrounding farms, where it was made into decorative gates. The former airfield is again used for agriculture. Small vineyards and farms now dot the countryside. But this story isn't about what remains in Italy today and doesn't rely on visible markers. It didn't end in Italy, and its impact continues even now, serving as an example that integration could and did work. The legacy of the Red Tails in the air is well known, protecting bombers over enemy skies and losing few of those bombers to enemy fighters. But this story is much greater and much grander. It originated with some good Americans at a fighter base in southern Italy, cooks, clerks, mechanics, pilots, medical staff, and virtually everyone at the base who put out that extra effort to welcome other good Americans in their time of need. Maybe, just maybe, the story isn't about race, but just comes down to decent men reaching out and helping one another, something Americans do best, creating change by example. There are many lessons to be learned here, but perhaps the airmen themselves say it best.
Those few days that I stayed there, I have recognized that it isn't a matter of black or white or race or anything else. They're just guys.
We had the Dear Lord with us and the Red Tails, and they treated us well, and they're great flyers.